I should have known the moment I heard the metal clang at 6:12 a.m. that the HOA had finally crossed a line they couldn't uncross. The sharp echo of steel hitting concrete carried through the cold morning air before I even opened my front door, and when I did, the smell of fresh-cut metal and cheap spray paint hit me like a warning I'd been expecting for weeks. My name is Ethan Caldwell, and I stood there barefoot on my own driveway, staring at the bright orange violation notice bolted onto my private electrical panel like it was some kind of public monument, the HOA seal stamped across it in bold black ink. Unauthorized modification, immediate action required. I ran my fingers along the edge of the paper, feeling the rough texture where they drilled straight into the housing without permission, and that's when I noticed the second detail, the one that made me stop breathing for just a second. They hadn't just tagged it. They'd shut it down. The quiet hum that used to live in that panel, the low steady vibration I barely noticed after months of living with it, was gone. Dead silence. No current. No system. Nothing. And across the street, standing with her arms folded like she was inspecting a job well done, was Victoria Hayes. Perfect posture. Perfect smile. White SUV idling behind her like a prop in some suburban power play. She didn't say a word at first. Just watched me take it in, like she was waiting for the reaction she thought she deserved. "Community standards," she finally called out, her voice smooth enough to sound polite if you didn't listen too closely. "We had to take action." I nodded once, slow, letting the words settle, tasting the faint bitterness of burnt insulation still hanging in the air. Because here's the thing about people like Victoria, they think action is power. They think a clipboard, a vote, and a stamped letter gives them control over everything they can see. What they don't understand is that sometimes, the moment they act, is the moment they lose. I stepped closer to the panel, crouched down, and brushed a layer of dust off the lower corner, right where the casing met the concrete base. Most people wouldn't have noticed it. Small. Out of place. But I knew exactly what I was looking at. Because that panel? It wasn't just some weekend project. It wasn't just unauthorized equipment. It was registered, documented, inspected, and more importantly, protected. I stood back up, slow, calm, the kind of calm that only comes when you realize everything is already in motion. Victoria tilted her head slightly, like she expected an argument, maybe even a raised voice. Instead, I just looked at her, then back at the dead panel, then down at the notice they'd proudly attached like a flag. And I smiled. Not because I thought this was funny. Not because I wasn't angry. But because in that exact moment, with the smell of metal still in the air and the silence where power used to hum, I realized something simple. The HOA had finally taken action. And that was their mistake. I did not say anything back to Victoria, not because I did not have something to say, but because I had already said everything that mattered weeks ago when I filed the paperwork she clearly never bothered to read, and as I stood there in that quiet driveway with the morning sun just starting to cut through the trees, I could feel the weight of every decision that led to this moment settling into place like gears locking into position. Because the truth is, I did not move into this neighborhood by accident, and I definitely did not install that system without knowing exactly how people like her would react. My name is Ethan Caldwell, licensed electrical contractor, 12 years in the field, and for the last 3, independent, which means every wire I run, every panel I install, every permit I pull, it all comes down to me, no shortcuts, no guesswork, just code, documentation, and results. And when I bought this house 6 months ago, I did it for one reason: the garage, 240 square feet of clean workspace with direct access to the main line, perfect for a small-scale residential energy setup, nothing flashy, nothing illegal, just efficient, and completely within state regulations. I remember the first time I powered it on, the low steady hum, the faint warmth radiating off the panel casing, the smell of new insulation settling into place. It was quiet, controlled, exactly how I like things, but it did not take long for that quiet to attract attention, especially from someone like Victoria Hayes. She showed up 2 weeks after installation, clipboard in hand, heels clicking against my driveway like she owned the concrete, asking questions she already thought she knew the answers to. "What is this for?" she had said, gesturing at the panel like it offended her personally. I told her the truth. Residential backup and load balancing system, fully permitted, fully inspected, and she smiled that tight, polite smile that never reached her eyes, the kind that says she is already planning her next move. "We will need to review this," she said, like she was granting me permission to exist, and that was the moment I knew exactly what kind of situation I was in. Because people like Victoria do not operate on facts, they operate on control, and anything they do not understand becomes a problem. They feel entitled to fix. Over the next few weeks the letters started. First a warning about non-compliant exterior equipment, then a fine for unauthorized modifications, each one stamped with the same HOA seal, each one more confident than the last, like repetition alone could turn opinion into authority. I responded to every single one the same way: certified mail, copies of permits, inspection reports, state compliance codes, everything documented down to the serial numbers. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I just gave them the facts, and every time I did, the silence on their end got a little longer. But silence does not mean surrender, not with people like her. It just means they are looking for another angle, and standing there now, staring at the dead panel and the notice bolted into place like some kind of victory flag, I could see exactly which angle she chose. She skipped the paperwork, skipped the process, and went straight to action, because in her mind, action equals authority, and authority equals control. But what she never stopped to consider, what she never even questioned, was whether she actually had the right to touch that system in the first place. And as I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, feeling the smooth glass warm against my palm, I could not help but notice how quiet everything had become. No hum, no vibration, just the distant sound of her SUV idling across the street and the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. And in that silence, one thought settled in with absolute clarity: she did not just shut off my system, she activated something a lot bigger. I did not rush to flip the breaker back or try to restart anything, because I knew better than that, and more importantly, I knew exactly what had just been triggered the second that system went dark, the kind of quiet that follows when a monitored line drops unexpectedly, not from a storm or a fault, but from a manual interruption that was never authorized. I tapped my phone once and opened the monitoring app. The screen lighting up with a clean interface I had configured myself, and there it was, time stamped down to the second, external disconnect detected at 6:11 a.m., location verified, system integrity compromised, the kind of language that sounds technical until you understand what it actually means. I zoomed in on the log, scrolling through the entries slowly, each line precise, each data point exactly where it should be: voltage drop, load interruption, remote alert dispatched. And then the one line I had been waiting for without even realizing it: regulatory notification. Sent. I let out a slow breath, the cool morning air mixing with that faint metallic scent still hanging around the panel. Because that line right there, that was not something you turn off or override with a clipboard and a signature. That was automatic, built into the system from the start. Not because I expected trouble, but because I prepared for it. And across the street I could feel Victoria watching me again. Her posture shifting slightly now, not as confident as before, like she was trying to read a situation she no longer fully understood. I glanced up just long enough to meet her eyes, and this time I did not smile. I just nodded once, calm, steady, the kind of acknowledgement that does not invite conversation, and then I went back to the screen, because the real story was not happening out here on the driveway anymore. It was already moving somewhere else, somewhere official, somewhere that does not care about HOA rules or neighborhood opinions. I stepped around to the side of the panel and crouched down again, brushing away a thin layer of dust near the base where a small metal plate was mounted, easy to miss if you were not looking for it, but impossible to ignore once you knew what it meant. Federal Compliance Registration Number, engraved. Clean and permanent, tied directly to the permit file I submitted months ago, the one that classified this system as part of a regulated energy support network. Nothing large-scale, nothing commercial, but enough to fall under a set of rules that operate far above anything a local association can touch. I remembered the inspector standing right where I was now, clipboard in hand, running through the checklist with that same neutral tone they all use. Once this is active, any unauthorized interference gets logged automatically, he had said, not as a warning, just as a fact, and I had nodded, signed the paperwork, and filed everything exactly where it needed to be, because that is how you stay protected, not by arguing louder, but by documenting better. I stood back up slowly, slipping my phone into my pocket as another notification buzzed softly against my palm, incoming acknowledgement received. And for a brief second I could almost hear the system coming back to life somewhere. Beyond my control, processes moving, flags being raised, people who actually have authority taking notice. And that is when the full weight of what Victoria had done finally settled in. She did not just shut down a panel she did not like, she interfered with a registered system she did not understand. And out here in the driveway it still looked simple, just a piece of paper bolted to a box and a quiet hum that had disappeared. But behind that silence, something had already started, something she could not stop, could not explain away, and definitely could not control. Victoria did not stay silent for long because people like her never do, and I could hear the faint crunch of gravel as she finally stepped off the curb and crossed the street toward me, each step measured, controlled, like she was still convinced this was her situation to manage, her heels clicking against the concrete in sharp, steady beats that cut through the quiet, and by the time she stopped a few feet away from me, I could smell that same expensive perfume trying to cover the faint trace of cigarette smoke that always seemed to follow her around. "I assume you understand why this had to be done," she said, holding up a copy of the violation notice like it carried more weight than it actually did, her tone calm but edged with that familiar authority she liked to lean on. "We have community guidelines, and your installation does not comply." I looked at the paper for a second, then back at her, not reacting, not arguing, just letting her fill the silence she had created, because that is what people like Victoria rely on, reaction, resistance, something they can push against, but I had already moved past that point. "You drilled into the housing," I said finally, my voice even, almost quiet. "And you cut the line." She did not hesitate, not even a flicker of doubt. "We exercised our right to enforce compliance," she replied, like she had rehearsed that sentence in front of a mirror, like saying it enough times would make it true. I nodded once, slow, letting the words settle between us, because this was the exact moment where everything separates, what she believes versus what actually exists, and behind her, I could see two more HOA board members standing near the sidewalk, watching from a distance, arms crossed, trying to look official, trying to look united. But even from where I stood I could see the uncertainty in their posture, the way they shifted their weight, the way they kept glancing at the panel like it might suddenly explain itself. "You should have addressed the notices," Victoria continued, stepping just a little closer, lowering her voice like this was some kind of private correction. "This could have been handled quietly." I almost smiled at that, not because it was funny, but because it was predictable, the idea that silence equals compliance. That if something is not challenged loudly, it must not exist at all. "I responded to every notice," I said, and this time I let a little more weight sit behind the words, not anger, just certainty. "Certified mail, permits, inspection reports, all of it." She waved a hand dismissively, like paperwork was an inconvenience rather than a boundary. "That does not change the fact that this installation affects the visual and functional standards of the community." And there it was again, that shift from fact to opinion, from law to preference, dressed up as authority. I glanced past her for a second, down the street where a few neighbors had started to slow their morning routines, watching from their driveways, coffee mugs in hand, the quiet curiosity of people who know something is happening but are not sure what it means yet, and then I looked back at Victoria, meeting her eyes directly this time. "You think this is about standards," I said, calm, steady. "But it is not." She tilted her head slightly, just enough to show she did not like the direction this was going. "Then what is it about?" she asked, and for the first time since she walked over, there was a small crack in that perfect confidence, a hint of something uncertain just beneath the surface. I took a slow breath, the cool air filling my lungs, grounding everything back into place, and I could feel that quiet shift again, the one that happens when a situation stops being local, stops being personal, and starts becoming something else. Entirely, something bigger, something official. It is about jurisdiction. I said, simple, direct, no extra weight, just the truth sitting exactly where it needed to be, and the second that word left my mouth, I saw it register, not fully, not completely, but enough to change something in the way she stood there, because for the first time since this started, Victoria Hayes was no longer completely sure she was in control. The word hung in the air longer than anything else she had said that morning, and I could see it working its way through her, not fully understood, not yet processed, but enough to disrupt that smooth, rehearsed confidence she had been leaning on since she stepped onto my driveway. Jurisdiction, she repeated, slower this time, like she was testing how it sounded, like it might still bend to her version of reality if she said it right. I did not answer immediately. I just watched her, watched the way her grip tightened slightly on the paper in her hand, the edges crinkling just enough to give away what her face was trying to hide, because this was the part most people miss, the moment where control starts to slip, not with noise, not with confrontation, but with a single idea they cannot immediately dismiss. One of the board members behind her shifted, clearing his throat like he was about to say something, then thought better of it, and that silence spread outward, settling over the small group that had gathered, neighbors pretending to check their mail, engines idling a little longer than usual, everyone sensing that something had changed even if they could not name it yet. "This is a residential property," Victoria said finally, her tone sharpening just a fraction, like she was trying to anchor herself back to something familiar. "Our association governs everything within this community." I nodded once, not disagreeing, not interrupting, just letting her finish building the argument she thought would hold, because the stronger she made it, the clearer the contrast would be when it broke. "Exterior modifications, utility installations, structural changes, all subject to HOA approval," she continued, more confident now that she was back on script. "You agreed to those terms when you purchased this home." I took a slow breath, the cool air still carrying that faint metallic scent from the panel behind me, and I could feel the steady rhythm of everything falling into place, not rushed, not forced, just inevitable. "You are right," I said, and that stopped her for a second, just enough to make her pause, because agreement was not what she expected. "I did agree to those terms," I continued, keeping my voice level, measured, "and I followed them." Her eyes narrowed slightly, the kind of reaction that comes when someone realizes the conversation is not going where they planned. "Then why is that system not approved?" she asked, and there was a slight edge to it now, not anger, not yet, but something closer to frustration. I turned slightly and gestured toward the panel, the orange notice still bright against the metal surface. "Because it does not require your approval," I said, simple, direct, and for a brief second the entire scene seemed to hold its breath, the distant hum of a passing car, the soft rustle of leaves, even the idle engine behind her, all of it fading just enough to make that sentence land exactly where it needed to. "That is not how this works," she replied quickly, almost too quickly, like she needed to push back before the idea settled too deeply. "Everything installed on this property falls under HOA review." I shook my head once, not dismissive, just certain. "Not when it is registered under state and federal compliance," I said, and this time I did not soften the words. I let them sit there, clear and unambiguous, because that was the line she had already crossed without realizing it. The line between what she controls and what she only thinks she controls, and I could see it now, the shift in her expression, small but undeniable, the moment where confidence meets uncertainty and does not immediately win. Another notification buzzed softly in my pocket, a quiet reminder that while this conversation was still happening out here in the open, something else was already moving behind it. Something she could not interrupt with a letter or a vote, and as I reached into my pocket, not even looking at the screen yet, I realized something that made the entire situation feel almost predictable. She was still trying to enforce rules, and I had already moved into a system that enforces consequences. I let the silence sit for a second longer after that, long enough for the weight of what I said to settle into the space between us, and when I finally pulled my phone out of my pocket, The screen was already awake, already waiting, a new notification blinking at the top like a quiet signal that things had moved forward without needing anyone's permission out here on the driveway. I did not rush to show it to her. I just looked at it first, reading the header carefully. Acknowledgement confirmed, external interference logged and escalated, estimated response window initiated, the kind of language that does not ask questions and does not wait for explanations, it just moves, and as I scrolled down slightly, I could feel Victoria watching me again, that same tight focus, but this time there was something different behind it, not control, not certainty, something closer to concern. Even if she was not ready to admit it yet. "What exactly are you claiming here?" she asked, her voice still controlled but lower now, like she was trying to keep this contained, keep it from turning into something public, something harder to manage. I glanced up at her, then back at the screen, then slipped the phone into my pocket again without handing it over, because this was not something she could read her way out of. "I am not claiming anything," I said, calm, steady. "I am letting the system do what it is designed to do." She frowned slightly, the first real crack in that polished expression. "System," she repeated, and I nodded once, turning slightly toward the panel behind me, the orange notice still bright against the metal, the drilled holes still visible where they had forced their way into something they did not understand. "When you interrupted that line," I said, tapping lightly against the casing with my knuckles, feeling the cold metal under my fingers, "you did not just shut off power, you triggered a compliance breach." One of the board members behind her shifted again, stepping a little closer now, curiosity starting to outweigh caution. "That is not possible," Victoria said quickly, but there was less conviction in it this time, like she was trying to push the idea away before it fully formed. "We are authorized to enforce community standards." I nodded again, not disagreeing, just clarifying. "Within your jurisdiction," I said, and that word landed harder this time, because now it had context, now it had consequences attached to it. And I could see her processing that, trying to measure where her authority actually ended, and whether she had already stepped past it. The air felt different now, heavier somehow, like the quiet had shifted from calm to waiting, and in the distance, just faint enough to almost miss if you were not listening for it, I heard the low rumble of an approaching vehicle, not fast, not loud, just steady, deliberate, the kind of movement that does not rush because it does not need to. I did not turn to look at it right away, I just let the sound build in the background while Victoria stood there, still holding that paper like it meant something, still trying to hold on to a version of control that was already slipping through her fingers. "You should have contacted us before installing anything like this," she said, one last attempt to reframe the situation, to bring it back into something she understood, something she could manage. I shook my head slowly, meeting her eyes again. "I did everything by the book," I said, and this time there was no room for interpretation, no soft edges, just the truth sitting exactly where it needed to be. "You just did not read the right book." And right. On cue, the sound behind us grew louder, tires rolling over asphalt, an engine idling down as it approached the curb, and for the first time since this started, I did not need to explain anything else, because whatever was coming next was not part of her system anymore. I did not turn immediately when the vehicle rolled to a stop behind us because I did not need to. The sound alone told me everything I needed to know: steady engine, clean idle, the kind of presence that does not belong to a neighbor running errands or someone passing through, and when the door opened, the soft thud carried across the driveway like punctuation at the end of a sentence that had already been written. I could feel it before I saw it, that subtle shift in the air when attention moves away from you and towards something else, something more official, and Victoria felt it too. I saw it in the way her shoulders stiffened slightly, the way her head turned just a fraction too quickly as she finally looked over her shoulder, the paper in her hand lowering by half an inch without her realizing it. I waited one more second before turning, just enough to let that moment settle, and then I faced the street, a dark gray county vehicle parked clean along the curb, no lights, no urgency, just quiet authority sitting exactly where it needed to be. A man stepped out, mid-40s maybe, button-down shirt, badge clipped at his belt, not showy, not dramatic, just official in a way that does not need explanation. He closed the door behind him and took a quick look around, not scanning for danger, just assessing. Like someone who has done this enough times to know exactly what matters and what does not, his eyes moved from the panel to the notice, then to me, then finally to Victoria, and there was a brief pause there, the kind that says he already understands more than anyone has said out loud. "Morning," he said, his voice even, neutral, and I nodded back. "Morning," I replied, simple, no need for anything else, because whatever came next was not about introductions, it was about confirmation. He stepped closer to the panel, crouching slightly to look at the base, his fingers brushing lightly against the engraved plate, tracing the numbers without touching anything else, careful, precise, and then he stood back up, turning toward Victoria. "Are you the one who authorized this modification?" he asked, and the way he said it was not accusatory, it was procedural, like the answer was already part of a form he was mentally filling out. Victoria straightened slightly, trying to recover that posture she had earlier, but it did not quite land the same now. "I am the president of the Homeowners Association," she said, her tone measured but tighter than before. "We enforced a compliance issue on this property." He nodded once, listening, but not reacting, not validating, just collecting. "Did you review the registration on this unit before taking action?" he asked, and that was the moment everything shifted, because that question did not belong to her world. It did not reference guidelines or aesthetics or community standards. It referenced something else entirely, something structured, something documented, something she had never considered necessary, and I could see it in her face, the hesitation, small but undeniable, the fraction of a second where she realized she did not have an answer ready. "We reviewed the exterior condition," she replied, choosing her words carefully now, but it was already too late. The difference between what she said and what he asked was sitting right there in the open, and he saw it, I saw it, everyone watching saw it. He nodded again, slower this time, like he had just confirmed exactly what he needed, and then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small notepad, flipping it open with a practiced motion. "I am going to need a copy of your authorization records and any documentation related to this action," he said, calm, direct, no raised voice, no confrontation, just process, and standing there with the quiet morning stretching out around us, with neighbors now fully watching from a distance, with that orange notice still bolted into my panel like a mistake frozen in place, I realized something simple. The trap had not just been set, it had already closed, and the only thing left now was watching it finish its work. Victoria did not answer right away, and that silence stretched longer than anything she had said all morning, longer than her speeches about standards, longer than her rehearsed authority. Because this time there was no script to fall back on, no rulebook she could quote to regain control. Her fingers tightened around the edge of that notice until the paper bent slightly, and for the first time, she looked down at it like it might not mean what she thought it meant, like it might actually be evidence instead of enforcement. "We followed standard HOA procedure," she said finally, but even as the words left her mouth, they sounded thinner, less certain, like they belonged to a different situation entirely. The man with the badge did not react, did not interrupt, he just wrote something down in his notepad, slow, deliberate, each stroke of the pen quiet but final. "I understand," he replied, his tone steady, "but I asked for authorization records specific to this unit." And that distinction landed hard, because now it was clear, painfully clear, that procedure was not enough, assumption was not enough, and authority without verification was not authority at all. One of the board members stepped forward slightly, clearing his throat like he was about to help, about to support her. But when he opened his mouth, nothing came out, just a quiet hesitation that hung there before he stepped back again, the weight of the moment pressing down on all of them, and I could feel it too, not as pressure, but as confirmation, everything unfolding exactly the way it was designed to, not fast, not dramatic, just precise, inevitable. The man turned back toward the panel, running his eyes over the drilled holes, the cut line, the bright orange notice fixed into place like a marker of where everything went wrong. "This unit is registered under a monitored compliance network," he said, not asking, not guessing, just stating a fact that had already been verified somewhere beyond this street, beyond this neighborhood. Any unauthorized interruption is automatically flagged and escalated. Victoria shook her head slightly, almost instinctively, like she was trying to reject the framework itself. We were not notified of any such classification, she said, and there was frustration there now, but also something else, something closer to realization, the kind that comes too late to change anything. That is because notification is not required at the HOA level, he replied, calm, almost detached. It is filed at the state level and tied directly to the permit and inspection records. And just like that, the entire structure she had been standing on collapsed without a sound. No argument, no confrontation, just a simple clarification of where her authority ended, and where it never existed to begin with. The neighbors watching from across the street shifted slightly, murmurs starting to ripple quietly as pieces of the situation clicked into place, the story no longer about a violation or a dispute, but about a mistake, a very specific kind of mistake. The kind that cannot be undone by rewriting a notice or calling an emergency meeting. The man closed his notepad with a soft snap, tucking it back into his pocket as he looked directly at Victoria. I will need you to provide documentation for your actions within 24 hours, he said, his voice still even, still controlled, but carrying a finality that left no room for negotiation. Failure to do so will result in further review and potential penalties. And there it was, not loud, not dramatic, just the quiet shift from control to consequence, from enforcement to accountability. Victoria stood there for a second longer, the morning sun catching the edge of that notice in her hand, her expression no longer confident, no longer certain, just still, like she was trying to hold on to something that had already slipped away. And as I looked back at the panel, at the drilled holes and the cut line in the silence where the hum used to be, I realized something simple. She had taken action, exactly the way she always did, fast, decisive, certain she was right, and now, for the first time, she was about to find out what that action actually cost. The county vehicle pulled away without any urgency, just a slow roll down the street like it had already done what it came to do, and the moment it turned the corner, the quiet came back. But it was not the same quiet from before, it was heavier, filled with something that had not been there earlier, something real. Victoria did not move right away. She just stood there holding that notice like it might still mean something if she did not let go of it, the edges now slightly bent, the bright orange not quite as bold as it looked an hour ago, and for a long second, no one said anything, not the board members behind her, not the neighbors watching from across the street, not even the wind moving through the trees. It was just still, like everything was waiting for her to do something, anything, that could put this back into her control. But there was nothing left to control. I stepped past her slowly, not brushing against her, not forcing anything, just moving toward the panel like I had been doing this all morning, because for me, nothing had changed. This was still my system, my work, my responsibility. I reached down and ran my fingers lightly along the casing again, feeling the cold metal, the drilled points where they had forced their way in, the clean edge where the line had been cut, and then I pulled my phone back out, the screen lighting up. Instantly, another notification waiting, compliance response logged, restoration authorized pending inspection, estimated service window confirmed. I exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that does not come from relief, but from certainty. Because everything was already in motion now, there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to prove, it was just process. Victoria finally shifted behind me, her heels scraping slightly against the concrete as she turned, and when she spoke, her voice was quieter than before, not weak, not broken, just different. This is not over, she said, but even she could hear how it sounded, not like a warning, not like authority, just something said because silence felt worse. I did not turn around, I did not respond right away, I just looked at the panel, at the notice, at the small engraved plate near the base that most people never noticed, and I thought about how simple it really was. She saw something she did not like, something she did not understand, and she acted fast, confident, certain she was protecting something, and now she was standing in the middle of a process she could not stop. I finally glanced back over my shoulder, just enough to meet her eyes one last time, and there was no anger there, no satisfaction, just clarity. It never was, I said, calm, steady, because this was never about winning or losing, it was about boundaries, the kind you do not see until you cross them, and once you do, there is no stepping back. The board members behind her were already shifting, murmuring quietly, one of them pulling out his phone, probably already thinking about meetings, about statements, about how to contain something that had already spread beyond them. The neighbors across the street were no longer pretending not to watch, conversations starting in low voices, the kind that travel fast in a place like this, and I could feel it all happening around me. But it did not matter, because the real outcome was not out. Here, not in the driveway, not in the whispers or the looks, it was already documented, already filed, already moving through channels that do not care about opinions or appearances. I reached up and peeled one corner of the notice away from the panel, not removing it, just enough to feel how loosely it held now, how temporary it really was, and I let it fall back into place, the edge tapping lightly against the metal with a soft, hollow sound, the same panel that had gone silent hours ago now sitting there waiting, not broken, not defeated, just paused. And as I slipped my phone back into my pocket and stepped away, I realized something simple. She thought taking action meant control, but real control does not make noise, it does not announce itself, it just waits, records, and responds, and by the time you realize it is there, it is already done.